Great. Thank you so much. Very excited to talk to you. I think one of the first talks that I ever gave as a researcher was with this group in 2014 when I finished my PhD and I came to visit Israel. And I think back then it was Shalvi and a few others in the department that kind of invited me and embraced me, even though back then I wasn't really sure what I was doing. But a lot has changed since 2014. And I think we've done quite a lot, especially since I came to HKU. Some of you might be familiar with some of the things that I do. But today, hopefully, I'll touch a lot on the stuff that I do, open science, meta science, that kind of stuff. But I will try and take a different angle with a perspective that I've been trying to promote in the last, let's say, year or two, in really turning the focus from aside, instead of us telling the world what it is that they should do about their decision making and how they should improve the way that they're thinking, turning that inwards and saying, if we know so much about judgment decision making and we understand heuristics and biases, is there something that we can learn about the way that we think, the way that we conduct research, the way that we disseminate research? And the more that I think about this, the more that I realize that actually there are so many things that I do in research and so many things that I see around me in the research community that are affected by all the things that we study. But somehow we've been telling others what to do, but we didn't really take the time in order to really think what the implications are for us. And I think this can come out in all sorts of ways. There's the so-called replication reproducibility crisis with the science reform, but also in the way that we do COVID-related pandemic situation research. So how can we improve and do better? I will try and show you some of the things that we've been doing at HKU and with my collaborators from around the world. We have a team of about, say, 50-something researchers from around the world who have joined me on some of these initiatives. But most of the projects that I will show you, I actually conduct with students. So the topic for today is the cognitive biases in us, in researchers. You're very welcome to download the slides. The link is over here. It will always appear over here on the bottom right. Download this, and if there's anything else you want to follow up on, I'd be very happy to. I will post this talk afterwards on this YouTube channel, so you're very welcome to have a look at this. There's some other talks about all sorts of other things, especially in regards to open science. I feel like every talk should start with this. I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to this, but I do feel like it's important to say, especially given in the last 2 weeks, the cancer research replication project came out with very discouraging findings. But in the last decade, we realized that a lot of things that we thought are okay and going well, actually there's some indications of issues, of the need for us to reassess, re-examine. At the beginning, it came from psychology, specifically social psychology. So a lot of the other sciences claim that we never really expected much from psychology, so no big deal. But then we challenged the other sciences to show us that they're doing it better, and we realized that they're really not doing any better. And this cancer research replication project really shows us that, if anything, social psychology and psychology are doing better than some of the exact sciences because of the incentives, because of the small samples, because of all sorts of other things in the process. But I will leave this at that, and then we'll come back to this kind of like at the end of what kind of solutions are there. I will start from a case study regarding priming. Not going to talk a lot about that, but if you want to know more about this, I give a whole course at HKU where I tell people about each and every one of those. So there's mass replications and there's singular replications. And this specific slide talks about priming. I think we all know that there is some issues with priming, how to define priming, what is social priming, cognitive priming. We're not going to go into this, but generally stuff that we consider to be classics, Sewell and Wire, the barge stuff, elderly priming, professor priming, warmth priming, all these priming, unscrambled sentences, stuff doesn't replicate. The only reason why I'm mentioning this here in a JDM talk is because of Kahneman. So Kahneman came out with a book, 2011. I admit it took me some time to get to this because I think academia ruined reading for me. So I haven't, it took me a while until I discovered audiobooks to really pay attention to this book. And I remember while I was jogging in the gym, listening to this audiobook, I think 2016, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, really interesting, good stuff. And then I came to chapter, I think 5 or 6, which was the chapter about priming. And I had to stop and sit and really listen very, very carefully because Kahneman was a very enthusiastic advocate of priming research, which by 2016, many of these mass replication efforts have failed. So I'm like, what is going on here? So Nobel Prize winning work, a lot of stuff, of course, that we know seems solid. I do mass replications in judgment decision making. Kahneman does solid stuff, but here he dedicates a whole chapter talking about priming research in 2011, before all these mass replications. What is happening with this? And turns out I dug into this, and turns out that a lot of people knew about this. And in 2012, he sent out an email to all the priming research folks, and he asked them, he said, I can see what he called a train wreck looming. And he said, all I have personally at stake is that I recently wrote a book that emphasizes priming research as a new approach to the study of associative memory. Count me in as a general believer. So Kahneman is a general believer. I think all of us were general believers. When I did my PhD, this was top of the research. You want to do priming research. Thing is, 5 years later, Daniel Kahneman, who is not a young person, went to a semi-anonymous blog that summarized the replications of this priming research and summarized this as this is a very bad chapter because most of the findings in this chapter do not replicate. And Daniel went on this blog and wrote a comment, and this is what he wrote in 2017. He says, what the blog gets absolutely right is that I place too much faith in underpowered studies. And then there's special irony in my mistake, because in the first paper that Amos Tversky and I published was about the belief in the law of small numbers, which allows researchers to trust the results of underpowered studies with unreasonably small samples. So all of these priming studies had maybe 15 in this condition, 15 in that condition, maybe 20 if it's like, but then we took these classics with the very, very small samples, and we just assumed because they're published in JPSP and all these big journal that they're correct. So he wrote this in 1969 and he published this in 1971. What he did back in that study, he went to statistician conferences and he talked to statisticians, and he showed that statisticians tend to put too much faith in underpowered studies. And if you look at this example from that study, suppose you run an experiment, 20 subjects, you have obtained a significant finding. How much do you think this is going to replicate? Which, if you take this one and you look at some of the priming literature, this is exactly the kind of thing that you would see in priming literature. It's almost like the same kind of statistics and the same kind of sample size. So basically, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman was going on and showing, you see, even statisticians are biased. The thing is that Daniel Kahneman is also biased. So he is the one who went around the world and told us about this bias, and he is the one who fell into this trap. So if Daniel Kahneman falls into this trap, then all of us can fall into this trap. So what is this an example of? For me, this is lots of things to gain from this case study, but this is bias blind spot. Them, the statisticians, them, the researchers, they're biased, but obviously I'm not, because I advocated this to the world. I made people aware of this. But I think Daniel Kahneman is very humble. So he knows that just by knowing about a bias does not mean that it's easier for you to overcome these biases. Now, it's not, I think, surprising that we were able to replicate this. And just in the last judgment and decision-making journal publication. So, oh, it's this month, November 2021. Our replication of the bias blind spot came out, and this is like a nice summary. I don't know if you're aware of the stuff that I do, but I run these replications with undergraduate students in Hong Kong. And as you can see, the undergraduates did this bias blind spot, and it was finally published in JDM. So you can see that bias blind spot is alive and well. Plus, I do these demonstrations in workshops and in my courses. So as you can see here, as a first step, what I do, so this is a capture from Mentimeter, and you can run this as well in your own classes. So we're talking about researchers and our students in an academic environment, and this is a judgment and decision-making course or a judgment and decision-making workshop. So these are people who are supposed to know everything about better than average effect and all sorts of self-other asymmetries. But of course, when I ask them, compare yourself to the other people in this workshop or the other people in this class, on dependability, on objectivity, on consideration for others, snobbery, deceptiveness, selfishness. So of course, they put themselves as higher on the positive traits and lower on the negative traits. Not very surprising, but I think it's nice to see this kind of demonstration. And then I tell them, you see, so all of us together as an aggregate, we're biased. And then the next step, which is exactly how you demonstrate the biased blind spot, I ask them, so compare yourself to others. Who is more biased on this self-serving tendency? And once again, you see this bias. The people think that others are more biased than they are, even if we just demonstrated that they are biased together with everybody else. And you can do this for every possible bias, and then you aggregate all these together, and this is how you demonstrate the biased blind spot. So even when we study judgment decision-making, even when we communicate this to the world, even when we just witnessed the existence of the bias in us, it's still very difficult for us to say, no, we're not biased. We're always less biased than others. And this is a problem, obviously. We need to think what to do about this and where does this manifest in the way that we do research. Another very interesting bias, and I think it's important to put this at the beginning, because also with some of the people in the faculty of Ben Gurion, when they're my editors, I submit some of my work and then I get some of you as my editors or my reviewers. I think there's some assumption, especially when we do replications, of what is it that we do as replicators? What are our intentions? What is it that we aim to get at? And I think there's a lot of hostility that started between, I think especially at the beginning, between the, let's say, original authors and the replicators. I think self-interest is overestimated. It's really interesting for me to look into. And there is a classic study that we also did a replication of. So this is a classic study by Miller and Ratner, 1998, JPSP, and we recently published this, in Collabora Psychology. And it was rejected from JSP for all sorts of interesting reasons that I won't go into. But basically what this article says, this replication, is that you have blood donations and you're asked to estimate, whether people will donate blood if they're unpaid or if they're paid. And as you can see here, people just assume that other people will donate more if they're paid rather than unpaid. So monetary incentives seem to be driving blood donations. So people are doing this only because they want to get paid for this. Smoking policy, people just assume that non-smokers don't want anti-smoking policies to take effect. So they think only about themselves and they don't think about the general population. So you see this very big difference between how people evaluate their own group and the others group. But when we actually look at the data, we asked smokers and non-smokers, what do you think about non-smoking policies? And actually, it really seems like people are willing to donate blood regardless of pay. Sometimes pay actually reduces the willingness to donate. Same thing with smoking. Actually, non-smokers, the smokers that non-smokers assume have self-interest, that the smokers are very supportive of non-smoking policies, even though it puts them in some problem when it comes to having to pay more, having to go outside and find the one spot where they can smoke. So you can see we ran this in 2 samples. One is the MTurk with Americans, one is prolific with British folks. And then the results are almost identical. It's unbelievable how well this replication went. So more than 2 decades after the original, we were able to see support for this. As you can see over here, I kind of tried to summarize what the implications are for science. So what original authors think about replicators is that they want to take me down rather than they want to do science, or they aim to do failed replications because that will give them prestige rather than the success to show that what I did was correct. They don't want to cooperate with us, or they think that they're better than I am. There's lots of suspicion and hostility. And replicators, the way that they usually, we tend to think about it is that the original authors perhaps think more about themselves than they do think about the accuracy of trustworthiness of science, that they would emphasize successful replications over whether there is an effect or not really in reality, my over R. So I think you get the gist of what it is that I'm trying to show here, where the self-interest is overestimated. If we have all these biases, then it's very difficult for us to communicate and work together when all of us want exactly the same kind of thing. And it's not just with replicators and original authors, but let's say the science reform movement. I get a lot of pushback when I go around the world and talk about these things. Even in my own department, people just assume all sorts of things about me because I publicly announce that I support open science and I advocate for science reform. I don't think that I know any better from others, but there's all sorts of assumptions about what it is that I am. And I know that in the open science community, and sometimes I fall into this trap as well, I tend to think they don't care about this as much as I do, like what is going on over here. But all these are just like biases that are happening in our minds. It could be that there's some truth in that, but I think overall as an aggregate, all of us want exactly the same things. Also, you don't need to think about replications in open science, but also just think of yourself as an author compared to how you're being evaluated as the reviewers and the editors. It's like we think about the reviewers and the editors is like they think more about the journal than they really think about science. My science is solid. Why don't they want to publish me? They think more about rejecting than about the science. They need to maintain their impact factors. The way that reviewers and editors think about the authors is that they just want to publish. They don't care about the way that I see things in terms of science, etc., etc. You get the idea. But the way that I view things is that if we understand that self-interest is overestimated, then science and the world could be much more like this. We help one another, we work together. All of us aim for the same goal, that we want to improve science. We want to get to the truth. We want to improve the way that we, the solutions and the things that we offer the general community, the public audiences. So my initial suggestions, and I'm like working on all sorts of ways in order to promote these sorts of things, is to shift defaults to assuming best interest. So when I talk about open science, I really say I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not saying you've done wrong. All of us did this until 2011. Some of us still don't really know what it is that's problematic about the way that we've been doing science. We need to work together in order to achieve this. And the only thing that I'm doing as a science reform open science advocate is that I'm offering services. So whoever is interested in working with me, I'd be happy to work with them. We need to disclose a lot more than our conflicts of interest. I don't think we've been doing a good job at that. We really need to disassociate, completely disentangle science from specific scientists. The fact that, I don't know, your study doesn't replicate, doesn't reflect anything on you. Like you found something, you communicated this. We had a lot of time as a community to try and check this. And it could be all sorts of things that happen, time change, context change, all sorts of things change. But really, it says nothing about you. There's science and there's you, and there's two things that need to be disassociated. Then we need a lot more humility. I also fail with this, especially as I get, more. I progress in my career and I talk to students, I catch myself sometimes. It's like sometimes these students are stronger than I am in statistics, in coding, in their knowledge of a specific phenomenon. But then just because I am a professor or I have more general experience, I just assume all sorts of things. And then I need to stop myself and say, we really need humility. Everybody can contribute. Students can contribute. I'll show you one more example of the general public can contribute. And we as professors, doesn't matter what stage we are, it could be that I have 50 years experience. If Daniel Kahneman can fall into this trap, all of us can fall into this trap. So we really need to be a little bit more humble. And another solution is adversarial collaborations, hopefully in the form of register reports. Moving on to confirmation bias. I really like this case study. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it blew up on YouTube 2-3 months ago, I think. And the case is called, this YouTube video is called Physics Professor Bet Me $10,000 that I'm wrong. So here you can see a very famous YouTuber. I've been following him for a very long time. He does some amazing science communication. And he published a video. I'll show you in a second what that was. And then this Professor Alex, a UCLA physics and astronomy professor, went on the YouTuber's channel and told him, what you just published in your YouTube video, you did a whole chapter on this. This is completely wrong. You need to take it back. And the amazing thing is that at some point the YouTuber said, how about we bet $10,000 on this? And the professor said, yes, let's go for it. That is an amazing way to resolve all kinds of science debate. What was this about? It was about this car. So this car runs only on wind. It has no energy source. It has no batteries. But the thing is that it can maintain speed faster than the wind that's pushing it. And it has something to do with the physics. And the physics professor said, this is not, I don't know where you took this from. This is impossible. How did they do this bet? Perhaps we should think in academia to do similar things. They did a public bet. They invited some science celebrities, like these folks over here, in order to observe and look at both sides that they're doing everything okay. And here you can see him holding his signature of the $10,000. And I really liked it because this YouTuber said, and I think all of us should publicly say this, after he did this, I also did this in my website. I want to know if I'm wrong. If you see a problem in anything that I communicated, anything that I published, and I will show you what my pledge is at the end of the talk, please let me know that I'm wrong. I really want to know this, and I'm willing to put money behind this. So the whole point of this channel is to get to the truth. The thing is that the YouTuber and I really wanted to know, the YouTuber showed evidence that, you know, if you do this on a treadmill with no wind gust, then it still works. So how does the professor explain this? And I was when I listened to the professor, actually this was some convincing stuff. So the professor was claiming that actually the experimenters that were running the experiment on the treadmill subconsciously were creating the results. So it can introduce unconscious. So he explains how without noticing what it is that they do, they're creating the effect, even though there is no effect over there. And he is 100% sure that the guy in the video who is demonstrating this does not do this on purpose. So I'm convinced, a lot of people are convinced, he's a professor from UCLA, physics. And so what is the bottom line? The professor was wrong and the YouTuber was right. It totally works, and it's very easy to demonstrate this. They've actually created a 3D model that anybody can print and check this by themselves. It takes $5 for you to print this. And the professor actually said that he was wrong, and he paid $10,000. And it's amazing to see this proof over here. Now, I have to say that when I saw this just blew my mind, because just like imagine, we discount science communicators, we discount YouTubers. We just say, because we have an academic degree, because I've been studying physics for I don't know how many years, therefore I know something. But if you think about this for a second, instead of taking $10,000 bet, he could just have tried this himself. Why don't you just try? It's very easy to try the exact same experiment. But the professor says, no, you're wrong. Let's bet on this. you could just replicate this. So instead of taking the time to really verify things, instead of taking the time to do a replication, really coming to this with humility, he decided to go head on and just like, let's correct this. So the professor assumed bias in others, but he didn't contemplate his own bias. Plus, whatever evidence or, looking at the equations and the theory and everything that's in there in physics, stuff that I don't really understand, every time he found evidence in support of his own theory, he said, yes, this is good, solid evidence. Whenever he saw something in the other side, he said, no, this can be solid evidence, which is remarkable. But if we try and summarize this, so there's a bias against replications. There's definitely a bias blind spot over here. And there's also a confirmation bias where, you try to support your own stuff. We also did a replication of confirmation bias. I don't think it comes as a great surprise to see that across whatever it is that we did, presentation modes and processing modes, we found evidence for confirmation bias. However, we summarize this as mixed evidence because Jonas over here with colleagues try to say that there's differences between presentation modes and processing modes, and we didn't really find this in quite the same direction. But in general, what I take from this replication attempt is that there is evidence for confirmation bias, and we did this with all sorts of things, looking at newspapers and the kind of evidence that people seek out. And of course, we can see this also with the pandemic. People seek out whatever it is that they think about COVID or whatever it is that they think about vaccinations. A little bit discouraging. The classic task, we didn't start just now in 2001. It didn't start even with Kahneman and Tversky. It started with the Watson task, where they gave them this kind of deck of cards, so a 3, 8, red and an orange. And then he says, each card has a number on one side and a patch of color on the other. You're asked to taste the hypothesis that for these 4 cards, if an even number appears on one side, then the opposite side is red. Which card would you turn? And it seems like most people just try again and again to confirm what it is. So they look at the obvious stuff. So the usual response is B and C are critical, but actually the most, I think, helpful one over here is actually D. I'm not going to go into all of this, but I just want to tell that the results of this from 1976 by Mahoney is that in a survey of 84 scientists, these are physicists, biologists, psychologists, sociologists, fewer than 10% correctly identified the critical cards. And there's a really good summary by John Barron that we don't really grasp null hypothesis significance testing well, because we really have this bias towards confirming, and null hypothesis significance testing is about rejecting the null hypothesis. Interestingly, most of this line of work about cognitive biases came to me. The first time that I heard about this was from Dorothy Bishop. So you can see she gave a talk in 2020, The Psychology of Experimental Psychologists, Overcoming Cognitive Constraints to Improve Research. So how we can help scientists stop fooling themselves, how we can fix the replication crisis by understanding researchers. So she's not a JDM researcher, but she wants to understand why is it that we're, our science seems to be failing us. And the problem is not science, the problem is the scientist, the human factor in all of that. So I'm putting this here just to show that Dorothy, she just retired recently from Oxford, very well-known scientist, a lot of citations, very high impact. The reason why I'm introducing her, beyond giving her credit for this whole line of research that I've started, is because she gave a recent talk in Meta Science. It's a conference. It's an amazing talk. She talks about confirmation bias. And if you go to 1125, she discusses her own meta-analysis and a systematic review, where she looks her studies of twins and genetic factors and all sorts of that. And here you can see she always cited the ones that had support for it, but she completely neglected to include one study that did not show an effect that could have completely change the results. And then she laughs at herself by saying, I completely forgot about this because it did not confirm with whatever it is that I wanted to. And the most ironic thing of all is that this study, the one that she neglected to recall and remember, was a study by her PhD student. So if Dorothy Bishop, who started this line of research about cognitive biases in research and researchers, says that she falls into this trap, like Daniel Kahneman, it's like, how can we not fall into these traps? We need to be very, very careful what we do. She gives a lot of interesting examples about the way that we do citations. So for example, we really want to get to the truth of something. So we say there are two sides. I'm going to look at both sides. But then when we Google the whole thing about the hotly debated topic, the first thing that confirms our opinion is the one thing that we cite, and then we say jackpot. So we cherry pick. I also like this thing from Twitter, so I adopted it over here. There's a new study released. Does the study validate my preconceived beliefs? If no, then it must be a bad study. I will find many flaws. Yes, it's a bad study. I was right all along, but if it confirms my beliefs, then it must be a good study. Then I'm right all along, I'm a genius. So these cognitive biases are inherent in all of us, and I think we can identify this in us if we just pay attention to what it is that we do. So we can see this in the way that we do citations, in the way that we do reviews of the literature. It's very difficult to de-bias this kind of thing. So confirmation bias is a very, very strong bias. The only way to really overcome this kind of bias is in advance set ourselves to very strict standards of how to conduct the systematic review with objective criteria that others can check us in order to make sure that this doesn't have a bias towards our own opinion. Collaborate with or ask for a review from others with different opinions. I think there's a lot of discussion in academia about most of academics being from the, let's say, more liberal, democratic, left side, left-wing part of the political landscape. And we need to be more inclusive. We need to really have different opinions in order to be able to tackle questions in an objective way. And we need to be more open, transparent about things and document all the weaknesses. Hindsight bias, I think all of us are aware of this. And we recently published in JSP replication and extension of two classic findings by Baruch Fischoff with Paul Slovic. And the reason why I'm mentioning this here, and I think this is the best case study of how we implemented showing that there is cognitive bias over the research process. So the ironic thing is that after we conducted the replications of study 1 was about Fischoff and study 2 was about Slovic and Fischoff, study 3, we found strong support for hindsight bias regarding perceived likelihood of our replication of hindsight bias. So the way that we did this is that we had estimates. So we had 3 groups. One is foresight, where we didn't tell them what the replication outcome was. So this is before anything, and you can see that the ratio, people assumed, yeah, there's a 65% likelihood that this is going to replicate, or 65% of the people thought that this is going to replicate. But when we told them that there was a positive outcome before that, that there was a successful, then it was higher. And when we told them, and we don't ask them, what do you think the next one is? We told them, if you would not have seen this outcome, what would you have predicted the outcome to be? And people update this. If it's a successful, it goes up. If it's a failure, it goes down. So we here see a demonstration of both hindsight bias, foresight versus hindsight, plus outcome bias, failed versus successful. So even when we tell people that we're doing a replication of hindsight bias, so we tell them what the results of hindsight bias is, we can see that they demonstrate hindsight bias over hindsight bias replicability, which we thought was a very interesting and ironic kind of demonstration of this effect. So there's obviously some implications for science. We knew this all along. Seeing study results affect the back calculated perceptions of success and value. And there are some problems because we disagree on what will replicate, and we really need to reassess. And there's a real problem with peer review because as reviewers, we see the outcomes, and the outcomes really change the way that we think about how competent the authors are, or whether it's interesting or not. How do you know it's interesting? What is considered interesting? If it's a null finding, it makes it less interesting. Not necessarily. That's really outcome bias, hindsight bias. So our solutions is that we need more cumulative updating science, we need register reports, and I'll come back to this, and we need outcome blinding. So when we submit this to journals, we really need to not show the reviewers, or maybe not all the reviewers, what the outcome is in order to ensure objectivity. We also did a replication of outcome bias, classic by Baron and Hershey in 1988. Won't go into this. Did all sorts of interesting extensions. Very similar, for me, takeaways from that about how we should overcome. Successful outcome could be, let's say, a successful replication, or even null findings versus this p-value lower than 0.05. We just assume that if people found support for something, or found support for rejecting the null hypothesis, that somehow they're more competent just because they were, but not necessarily. It could be as rigorous. Sometimes null findings are needed in order for us to really understand what is going on in update. We want to know if a vaccine doesn't work, if a drug doesn't work. We need these null findings. If we only report what works, then we might take all sorts of things that we shouldn't, and the literature will be very biased. Outcome bias and focusing illusion. There's a case study here. One of the main problems that we have is that we are not recruiting for the right things. We're recruiting candidate A versus candidate B. How much they published? Did they publish, same kind of resources? You have two candidates. All of them have access to 2,000 participants. All of them are looking at similar effects. One published 33. One published 21. Most of the departments, definitely mine and HKU, would say, we want the person who published 33 statistically significant results. What's the problem? The problem is that you're not taking into consideration power, and not taking into consideration practices like open practices. So even if none of them are doing p-hacking and all of that, but if they found an effect, just looking at the resources, 2,000 divided by the number of studies, then we're talking about much smaller samples. So candidate B really took, invested more in each one of these studies. And when we look at the replicability of these and the likelihood of them actually being a solid phenomenon, then candidate B's findings are much more likely to be solid. So we emphasize candidate A because this p-value lower than 0.05, and they published and more. But actually, it could be that we're really, we really should be aiming for candidate B, and we're doing ourselves real harm by going for candidate A. Default effect, very, very briefly, we also did a replication of default effect. Wouldn't come as a big surprise that the science paper was replicated, maybe not to the same extent. This is the original here on the left. This is a replication over here on the right. And as you can see, there's definitely opt-in and opt-out works. However, different than some of the originals. So we did two replications, one of the classic from Science and another one earlier from 2002. That contrasted default effects versus framing effects, and actually we found the framing effects are much stronger than default effects. So this one worked, or even though it's weaker, but this one didn't. However, I have, I'm pretty sure the defaults have an impact. There's lots of meta-analysis and evidence in that. We just need to make sure what exactly works and what doesn't. And if you want to see a live demonstration of default effect, I actually ran this in my workshop. So I did a workshop in 2020 where I introduced pre-registrations and register report. We had 200 participants, and I asked them to go on call checks, and it randomly assigned them into different conditions. And I asked them to say whether they would be willing to endorse open science practices. And open science practices are about sharing their data in code and about pre-registration. And as you can see, I randomized them into three conditions: no open science default, so a default of no, a default of yes, and a neutral without a default. And as you can see, the ratio at the beginning, when the neutral one is much closer to the yes, it's an open science. It's an open science workshop, so that makes sense. However, when you set the defaults to no, then people start to hesitate. And right now, I think in the world, most of the defaults are definitely no. Same thing for pre-registration. If the defaults are for no, then people will go with the default. Even though they're open science supportive, they came to a register report workshop. Just by me setting the default to no, half of them kind of disappeared into I will not do a pre-registration. That's unfortunate. So we really need to consider defaults in the way that we do science. Let's just set the defaults to sharing and doing pre-registrations. And then if people want to opt out, they can opt out. But at the very least, let's make it easy for them to choose the right thing, to choose the right option. Okay, I think it's I can start wrapping up a little bit. A good book came out, I think 2015. Chris Chambers, he's the one also who advocated for register reports. And I like this, The 7 Deadly Sins of Psychology, a manifesto for reforming the culture of science practice. And he discusses the sin of bias, which is in all of us. We know this as judgment decision-making researchers. Outcome bias, confirmation bias, publication bias, hindsight bias, all the biases that we look at in our literature, in our are affecting our science. By now, we already know this is, it should have been called, the book should have been called The 7 Deadly Sins of Science, not of Psychology, because we can see this in almost every other scientific field. Now, this semester, you can see over here, syllabus of this year, 2021 autumn, I gave my students, my undergraduate students, the task of writing, collaboratively writing manuscripts about cognitive biases in researchers and research. And they submitted this this week. And you're very welcome to look at their outputs. They did a much better job than I did over here in this talk. So they covered outcome bias, hindsight bias, bias blind spot, also added status quo bias, omission bias, and all the others. So if you want to know more about all of these students do incredible work. I'm very proud of them. So you can go in and look at that. Actually, if you want to join us, if you care about this and you want to take their work and submit this to a journal as an opinion piece or something review, we'd love to collaborate with you. Just let me know. Initial solutions: open up, share everything, make it public, and incentivize red teams. What is red teams? Red teams is this idea, just like open source, when we want to know if there's a bug. Let's say if you work in Jamovi or R and you run all sorts of packages, and we want to know whether this thing has any bugs, we can wait till somebody actually finds a bug and then reports this on GitHub, but we can invite people to hack this, to find all sorts of things, and we can offer incentives. So let's say, for example, I don't know, Checkpoint or whoever does firewalls in Israel puts up a firewall and says, if you get through the firewall, we will compensate you, we'll give you an award, we'll give you some money. I do this as well. So every year with my students, they review, they do science assessments. At the beginning, we did science assessments of others, of published literature, of other replications and other original articles. But then people said, you're doing this for others, but you're not doing this for yourself. And then I said, yes, you're right. I should do this on my own publications. So every year, to 2020 and 2021, we looked at our previous replications from the previous year. And it's quite amazing because we find a lot of issues. And if you want to do this in your own courses, we have a template for this. If undergraduates, second to fourth year, can do this at HKU, I'm sure they can do this in your courses as well. Plus, this year, I also, following the YouTuber, I decided to add this section to my website. Check me, replicate me, corrections and replications of my work. I will pay you. If you're willing to put the time into looking at my work and you find some issues, I will give you $5 for a minor one, I don't know, something small. But if there's a major one, I will pay $50 because I don't want to be the UCLA professor. I don't want to be, in 10, 20 years, realize that I published some mistake. I want you to help me find this. And this semester, not only did I grade their RR assessments, but I also told the students, actually, if you find something in our previous year's the students, the stuff that we submitted to journals, the students that did their thesis with me, if you find stuff, I will pay you. And I had to pay them. So they identified lots of issues. Only one of them was major, but some minor issues. So that cost me like almost, I think at the end, it was $250 US, which they decided to donate to GiveWell. So win-win for everybody, win-win for society, for science, for us, for the students. It's beautiful. I love this model. Another solution is register reports and peer community in register reports. So I'm hoping that you're familiar with register reports by now, but this is our science process. It has a lot of problems. As you can see, we have indicated in each and every step of the research lifecycle that there is an issue: lack of replications, low statistical power, selective reporting, harking, publication bias, and all that. This has a lot to do with the current publication model, where we just review things after we've collected the data and wrote the report. And by then it's too late to change everything. So reviewers just, hammer us in the wrong things that we've done. And if they don't like the article or the outcome, they reject it, and then it goes to the file drawer. So this includes, of course, hindsight bias, outcome bias, confirmation bias. This is a broken process, in my view. Registered report model means that you submit your pre-registration plan. This is the pre-registration plan. You do this as elaborate as you can. Then you submit this to the journal. You work together with the reviewers. They give you some feedback on the kind of things like, are your hypothesis well-founded? Is it rigorous enough? So there's no outcomes to discuss. They just ensure that everything should be, is done appropriately. Only after both of you agree that this is the best rigorous test for the hypothesis, for the theory, then they give you an in-principle acceptance. And that means that regardless of the outcome, p-value higher or lower than 0.05, failed, successful replication, it doesn't really matter. This is going to get published. And then in the second stage of the peer review, they just ensure that you've followed the approved protocol or documented the deviations, and there's some justification for that, and that there's some positive controls and whether they succeeded or not. So from this broken model with a lot of problems, now we get to this point where we don't have a publication bias because we publish everything regardless of outcomes. It really eliminates all sorts of things like p-hacking. It ensures all sorts of good practices like statistical powers and all that. I won't go into this, but by now we have a lot of evidence that pre-registrations and registered reports really work. It really reduces the outcome bias, hindsight bias, publication bias, and so forth. Plus, this is the most recent one that came out. I think this is a terrific one where they did almost like a randomized control trial of registered reports versus the traditional model, and they show that people have assessed, being blinded to it, methods rigor, quality of methods, analysis rigor, overall quality of the paper. The registered reports do better than the traditional model. So I strongly recommend this to you. Plus, this is a revolution, I think, that started this year. I don't know if you're aware of this, but now we have something called peer community in registered reports. Rather than journals doing registered reports, you submit this to the community, and people like Chris Chambers are called recommenders. They're like editors, and they are the ones who are going to review this. So the community reviews your paper, and once it's in principle accepted by the community, you can choose as the author, you can choose after the in-principle acceptance one of right now 25 different journals who are endorsing this in-principle acceptance. And it has all sorts of things, even things like Nature, Human Behavior is listed as an interested journal, Collabora Psychology, perhaps others that you publish with. So this is revolutionary, but especially important for me in peer community is that you can schedule the peer review to be in a period of 2 weeks. And this is important because I want all my thesis students from this year to do register reports. And because I am afraid that the peer review will take too long, now they guarantee within 2 weeks, you get the peer review, then they give you a chance to revise. Rejection rates for registered reports are very low, below 10%. So all my 12 thesis students are going to do peer community in registry reports. So there's no reason why most of them shouldn't get a publication out of this, and the community, academia in general, science will benefit. In addition, and this is from this week, December 17th, I was able to convince my university that it's in their best interest to fund in principally acceptance register reports. So they allocated 8,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is about 1,000 US dollars, to say, if you're as a student at HKU and you can show us an in principle acceptance, you get funding for your data collection, 1,000 US dollars. So really win-win for everybody, the students, science, university. So this is a new initiative. We have for 30 of those. So this is a pilot. Hopefully, this will be the future of science at HKU, working together with students on register reports. So that was a very, very quick overview of cognitive biases. I didn't touch on all of them, just showed you teasers of all sorts of things that we do and the way that we tackle this. But if this is interesting for you, if you would like to work with us on replications and extensions, on register reports, if you want to collaborate with me or our students or the team of 50 plus early career researchers from around the world, there's a way to join us. You're very welcome to click on this link. All sorts of things that you can do. We have lots of primers, guides, opinion, manuscripts, templates, manuals. All of this is collaborative. If you come in, you add something, you put in what your contribution is, and you're a co-author immediately. This is how we work in the open science community. If you want to see more about our mass replication project, we finished more than 100 of those by now after 3 years of running this. So all the information with all the resources and everything about what we do and what I do and this upcoming direction of cognitive biases is on this webpage. I'm very active on Twitter, so you're very welcome to follow me. We also have a mailing list about all the workshops and the talks that are coming up. But if you have a specific question, if there's something about implementing open science, meta science, if there's something about this direction of cognitive biases in research or researchers that you would like to talk about, please contact me. This is my email. I try to be very responsive, and I'll be happy to schedule a talk with you and see how we can help you to do better in your own research in open science, meta science, and collaborate together. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.